Good morning. Assalamu alaikum for my colleagues from the Middle East. I would like to start by thanking my dear friend Yunus, the Senator, Sheikh Nawaf, and all that have made this brilliant event possible here today. It's such a privilege and pride for my foundation to participate here and to help drive some of the discussions, some of the learnings, and hope that outcomes from this will at least go some way towards shaping what happens next. As we will be spending 2 whole days talking about the Middle East, which is my own area of expertise, I chose this time for my opening remarks not to touch the Middle East because I did not want to preempt what many of my very eminent colleagues here will speak about. Instead, having spent all this week in New York at the United Nations, I would like to preface my remarks by talking of 2 things that worry me immensely from what I saw at the UN in New York. I believe that we are at an inflection point when the world order in which I was born is going through a tectonic shift, one in which we are likely to see a world in chaos and disorder before a new order is born. Let me first address the irrelevance of the United Nations. As you all know, the UN was founded in October 1945 amid a burst of idealism in the aftermath of the Second World War. Smart leaders understood that their principal power stemmed from the pulpit. They could publicly shame and scold the member states, and member states would have to do something about that. It was said that the UN was created not to lead mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. But even here, it has failed because most of its secretary generals usually dance on eggshells and engage in the masterly art of UN diplomaties and very rarely employ fireworks. 2 examples come to mind when my dear friend Kofi Annan on the weapons of mass destruction Iraq issue used fireworks, and recently Gutierrez has started to use that on Gaza. The world, though, no longer seems to be listening to the UN. The wars ranging in Ukraine, Gaza, and Sudan have underlined an impression that the order enshrined in the UN Charter is in absolute tatters. The UN often appears a mere spectator to a world where increasingly, as Yunus said, might is said to be right. For UN officials, though, criticism is nothing new. American conservatives have long seen the UN as a brake on US power and accused it of being too partial to the views of the Global South and the progressive agenda. On the other hand, developing countries have in turn accused the UN of being at times biased in favor of the West. In this no-win situation, the UN has also gained a reputation in the field as a bureaucratic, ill-equipped behemoth for a very fast-paced world. But as world leaders gathered in New York this week for the UNGA, and it is the 80th anniversary of its founding, there was a recognition that UN was facing its most intense pressure over its purpose, and even the Pope, of all the people, the Pope, has joined in the criticism. At the heart of the crisis in the UN is the deadlock presented in the Security Council. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 shattered the idea of the inviolability of national borders and led to paralysis at the Security Council, where Russia, along with US, China, UK, and France, have veto-wielding status. And now Donald Trump's combatively unilateralist US administration in different ways is flouting and undermining the world body's founding prescription and values. The UN at 80 is facing 2 crises at the same time, both within and without crisis. The within stems from 20 years of decaying authority, decaying capability, and decaying impact, particularly amongst those it is needed for the poorest, and the people in conflict zones. The crisis without stems from a return to great power conflict and great power competition, leading to paralysis in the Security Council not seen in 50 years. And this is at a time when a founding member, the most important power in the world, United States, acts in every way as if the UN was an irrelevance, except when it considers it as an active obstacle. Externally, the UN faces a third challenge posed by the emerging would-be competitor groupings driven by the powerhouses of the Global South. You've seen the emergence of BRICS, you've seen the emergence of many of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as well as traditional supporters in Europe. For the UN, this triple crisis happening at the same time is existential. Allies of the UN talk bullishly of the crisis as an opportunity for much-needed changes. They hope that this will pave the way for a slimmer, more streamlined organization which is refocused on defending the core values of its founders. But there is a gloomier scenario in the air. The lot of the League of Nations, the ill-fated First World War precursor of the UN, drifted into international oblivion as it failed to prevent the slide to the Second World War. We could be drifting to a Third World War, and it looks like the history repeats itself with the UN being in a position not to be able to stop this. In conclusion, the UN is definitely at a point of its irrelevance. That is its predicament. The dream might live on, but no one looks at the news and says, what is happening at the UN? It doesn't matter. In conclusion, the UN, can it be rescued? Yes, but it is a matter of will. And it's not about recreating the UN of the past. It requires a whole different structure and a different approach. The Secretary General has presented a paper. It's called UN 80. If you have the time, I would urge you to read it because it's useful. But sadly, his term as at the helm of the UN will expire before he will have the ability to implement those proposals. In essence, he's suggesting that there has to be massive efficiency and cost cutting, a proposed 20% reduction in the Secretarial's $3.7 billion budget, implying nearly 7,000 job losses at the time when the UN's mandate is even more necessary than before. It is going to curtail or chop 3,600 mandates to eliminate redundancies and focus resources on pressing challenges such as climate change, a matter the US does not believe it even exists. And thirdly, structural reconfiguration where we have a multiple of agencies all tripping over each other and trying to do the same job. The drivers are clear. At the moment, there is donor fatigue. The UN has $2.4 billion in arrears, of which $1.5 billion alone is owed by the United States. There is skepticism about its relevance in face of the Security Council paralysis. The obstacles are formidable, and great powers resist reform because nobody would like to give up what they already have. Any serious structural reform, though, will have to gain the backing of the 193 member states. But the most important actor, as throughout the UN's history, will be the US. Not only did it shape the organization in 1945, but it has also been its principal funder, even though it has been upset at times and ignored its prescriptions. The US has had double standards throughout the UN's existence, but it has continued to underwrite it and sought to describe its foreign policy in accordance with the UN principles, even when that has been a stretch. But now not only is the whole international rules order virtually gone, but Trump's America First deal-making approach has strained the relationship with the UN close to breaking point. I don't have the time here, but I could happily tell you about my own work with the late Kofi Annan in how the UN Security Council should be altered, both in terms of its composition and also its voting power, where you have very few issues on which a veto is required. Most other issues should be passable on a majority basis. This brings me to my second point today, which is a new world order. Questions facing global leadership include whether this transition will embrace a global conflict following which there will be a reset, or will it be approached via what I call gradualism, a phenomena which Western powers have employed to instill free market liberal democracy in the developing world, but have largely failed because of their uneven application and often their refusal to accept its outcomes. Nonetheless, I would hope for gradualism rather than a big bang. This will give time for competing powers and their visions of a new world order to fully understand each other, and also to conclude that there is more that unites us than divides us with respect to the existential threats that we face, including nuclear non-proliferation, climate change, and resource scarcity. But the wars in the US, in Ukraine and the Middle East have shown that we could well see a global conflict emerging before a reset. Some would argue that a conflict is inevitable, but can it be contained so it doesn't become existential? I don't know. Although not ideal, a favorable outcome would be where conflicts are localized and somewhat asymmetric in nature. But what sort of a global order do we want to see? The knee-jerk response is that it could be bipolar, with the rising of China competing with the United States. A new Cold War, but nobody knows. I hope, maybe in vain, that it will be a multipolar order in which military might, economic might, technological might, environmental mitigation will all be led by different powers in a collaborative manner. An extension of this blue sky scenario could also see the emergence of global netizens, global citizens of the net, transcending all borders and barriers. Whether we transition abruptly or gradually, it is clear that many institutions and instruments devised after World War II are largely not fit for purpose. I have discussed the UN, but the World Bank and the IMF are largely seen to be supporting democracies of the rich, by the rich, and for the rich. And the alternatives are at too early a stage in their development to know how sustainable they might be. Cancelling existing institutions is not an option. Instead, what we are likely to see that they will marginalize, and finally their irrelevance will be obvious for everyone. Based on these present trends, it seems that a shift in the balance of global power could impose a new world order that is not driven by ideology or geopolitics or bloc politics, but one where the focus will be much less military, security and sanction-centric, and more economic development-centric, and of course it will need to be de-dollarized. I come from the world of business, and a key matrix we deploy to measure success is return on investment. Look at these statistics. The West has invested more than $4 trillion in fighting wars on terror, of which $3 trillion was invested by the US alone, whereas China has invested so far roughly $1 trillion in BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, and it's not rocket science to conclude that if success is measured solely by friendship, collaboration, and economic advancement, then China has outperformed the West. Any recognition of this conclusion, though, will require a recalibration of the prevailing diametrically opposed views of world order and systems under which societies are organized and governed. At the very least, a better alignment and collaboration through dialogue on security, technology, environment, prosperity, energy, and empowerment will be an imperative. To get there, we might initially see power shifting from the global institutions that I was brought up under to fragmented but nonetheless more solidified and effective arrangements with an expansionist mindset such as the G7, NATO, AUKUS, EU on the one side, and the SCO, BRICS, ASEAN, BRI, etc. on the other. Layer on this the African Union, the GCC, and the Commonwealth, and we see complexity. Relationships are more transactional than ever before. They will be offering competing visions of a new world order, but only a major reset will dictate which will prevail. For now, it looks like the chips might just favor the globalizing South as opposed to the nationalistic North. As for my own country, as I said last night at dinner, the United Kingdom, Unfortunately for now, but hopefully for not too long, we are busy scoring on goals as we are unable to reconcile the past, which we cannot forget, with a future which we simply cannot control. I will stop here by saying that the impact of all these trends I've highlighted can and will be felt everywhere, but most importantly in the Middle East. Thank you very much.